A normal breakfast at a roadside diner turned into a nightmare. Two police officers decided to attack Chuck Norris's wife and children right in front of everyone. But they had no idea who would walk through the cafe door a few minutes later. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments which city or country you are watching this video from. The Texas sun rose with its usual brilliance, spilling molten gold across the endless highway and shimmering in heat waves that blurred the horizon. The family SUV hummed steadily down the interstate, a dark shape gliding through the morning light as the Norris family began their weekend journey. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and relaxed, filled with the kind of easy chatter that only comes when a family feels at peace together. For once, there were no film sets or martial arts demonstrations demanding his time, no obligations that pulled him in the 10 different directions. Today, Chuck Norris was not the actor, not the icon of strength and justice whose name echoed in 1,000 stories and jokes. Today, he was simply a husband, a father, a man enjoying the rare gift of uninterrupted hours with those he loved most. Behind the wheel, Chuck carried himself with the same quiet composure that had followed him through every stage of life. His posture was straight, hands steady on the wheel, his eyes sweeping the road with the attentiveness of a man who had learned long ago to never take anything for granted. Though relaxed, his awareness was constant, the habit of a fighter and a veteran who knew that even on the safest road, vigilance mattered. In the passenger seat, Gina, his wife, sat with her usual grace, her hair pulled back loosely as she scrolled through her phone and occasionally glanced at the old folded map resting in her lap. She had always balanced the modern with the traditional, the practical with the sentimental. Every now and then she looked at Chuck, and in those glances was a wealth of history, trust built over decades, respect that ran deeper than words, and an affection that needed no show to prove its strength. In the back seat, Dakota and Danilee brought their own kind of music to the journey. They had grown from children into spirited teenagers, each with their own quirks and their own blend of independence and attachment. Dakota, restless and quick-witted, pressed his face to the window, calling out each time he spotted a hawk circling above the fields or a half-collapsed barn leaning into the prairie winds. His sister Danilee, quieter but no less sharp, scribbled in a notebook balanced on her knees, her headphones askew so she could half listen to music and half listen to the conversation. They teased each other, argued over whose playlist should play through the car speakers, and then laughed together in the next breath. The rhythm of siblings who had grown up in the shadow of their father's legend, yet were carving their own identities with pride. Chuck's voice, calm and low, blended into the sounds of the road whenever he chimed in. He told them about the towns they passed, small histories picked up from decades of traveling the back roads of Texas. Some stories were lighthearted, like the one about a diner where the jukebox had once played nothing but Elvis until the machine broke and refused to stop. Others carried the gravity of memory, like recalling training bases he had driven by during his time in the Air Force before his career carried him into martial arts and films. His stories never came as boasts, only as pieces of a life he was willing to share, always with the lesson tucked quietly between the lines. The family stopped now and again, stretching their legs at gas stations, buying sodas and snacks, snapping quick photos of strange roadside attractions that seemed frozen in time. Yet even in those simple moments, Chuck noticed things most people would have overlooked. A pair of men sitting in a pickup at the edge of one small town who fell silent when the SUV pulled in. The way the grocery store clerk avoided eye contact, handing back change without a word. He did not mention it aloud, but the little signs were familiar, whispers of unease that came from a long life of reading rooms, people, and the currents beneath polite surfaces. Back in the car, Gina leaned against the seat with a sigh, smiling as she watched the children argue over whether they should get burgers or barbecue when they stopped for lunch. "It's too beautiful a day to worry about anything," she said, reaching for Chuck's hand, and he nodded, giving her fingers a gentle squeeze. For her, this was about time together, about memories built in the quiet stretches between destinations. For him, it was that too, but it was also about being ready, always ready, to protect the sanctuary that was his family. As the morning stretched on, the highway narrowed, trading the wide expanse of interstate for smaller roads lined with thick stands of oak and pine. The SUV rolled past weathered barns and ranch gates with faded signs, past pickup trucks parked in gravel driveways, past little towns where flags hung limp in the still air. There was a rhythm to rural Texas, one Chuck knew well, a rhythm of pride and tradition, of communities that lived by their own rules. Some welcomed visitors, others watched them with suspicion. When Gina pointed out a billboard promising homemade pies and the best coffee in Oakwood County, both Dakota and Danielle immediately chimed in that they wanted to stop. Chuck considered it silently. He had noticed the patrol car parked near the last intersection, the two officers leaning against it as they laughed about something only they shared. He remembered the way their eyes had flicked toward his vehicle, sharp and measuring. His instincts stirred, whispering caution. Yet he also knew the balance he had to strike. His children deserved moments of normalcy, deserved to see the world without the constant shadow of his watchfulness hanging over them. "All right," he said finally, and his children cheered softly in the back seat. Gina smiled, pleased to see him agree. "Let's see if their pies live up to the sign." The SUV pulled off the main road, gravel crunching under the tires as they turned toward a small diner tucked beside a line of pines. The building was old but bright, its paint once white now yellowed slightly by years of sun and rain. The neon sign buzzed faintly, promising coffee and comfort food, though a few letters flickered with stubborn disrepair. The parking lot was half full, dotted with trucks and older sedans bearing county plates. Chuck eased the vehicle into a space near the entrance, cutting the engine as the cicadas buzzed loudly in the summer heat. He sat for a moment, his eyes sweeping the lot, noting every face he could see through the windows, every shift of movement inside. To his children, it was just another stop. To Gina, it was a chance for coffee and rest. To him, it was another moment where the past whispered that peace could be fragile, that vigilance was never wasted. He climbed out and stretched, his body still carrying the strength and precision of a fighter despite the years. His children spilled out after him, laughing as they pushed at each other, oblivious to the weight of his thoughts. Gina joined them, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead as she inhaled the scent of bacon and fried potatoes drifting from the open window. The bell above the diner's door jingled faintly as Chuck held it open for his family, the sound almost cheerful in contrast to the silence that followed when they stepped inside. Conversations that had been flowing moments earlier faltered, eyes turned, and in that instant he felt it again, that subtle shift, the way a room changed when strangers entered. He met the gazes calmly, not with challenge, but with the steady weight of a man who would not be moved. Then he guided his family toward a booth, sliding into the seat with his back against the wall, his eyes already cataloging every detail of their surroundings. The family believed they were there for breakfast. Chuck knew they had also stepped into something else, something he could not yet name, but could already feel pressing at the edges of the room. It was only the beginning of the day, and already the air carried the taste of unease. The moment the door swung shut behind them, Chuck felt the weight of the diner settle over his shoulders like a damp blanket. The sound of the bell faded into the silence that followed, a silence so palpable it pressed against his ears. He could see the way conversations faltered, the way eyes flicked toward his family and then just as quickly away, as though people wanted to look but feared to be caught staring. The smell of bacon, coffee, and fried potatoes lingered in the air, but even those homely scents could not disguise the unease that had settled in the room. Dakota glanced around, his expression uncertain, and muttered something under his breath to his sister. Danielle hugged her notebook closer, her lips pressed into a thin line. Gina, always composed, gave a reassuring smile, though Chuck could see the tightness in her jaw. He guided them toward a booth near the window, the vinyl seats cracked from years of use, and slid in with a deliberate choice to sit with his back against the wall. It was an old instinct, a soldier's habit, one his family recognized but never questioned. The waitress approached after a moment, a woman in her late 50s with her graying hair pulled back into a bun. Her eyes betrayed no warmth as she dropped menus on the table. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yes, please," Gina replied with practiced politeness, "and orange juice for the kids." The waitress scribbled something on her pad, then walked away without another word. The scrape of her shoes against the worn linoleum echoed louder than it should have, a small reminder that everything in the diner seemed to carry too much weight. Chuck let his gaze sweep the room. Most of the customers looked like locals, men in work shirts with rolled-up sleeves, a few families with children, a couple of older farmers leaning over their coffee cups. Yet there was something about their posture, the way they bent over their food, that suggested they were paying far more attention to the Norris family than they pretended. The air held the brittle tension of a room pretending at normalcy, while every person inside knew otherwise. Gina leaned closer and lowered her voice. It feels like we've stepped into a church service in the middle of the sermon. Chuck gave the barest hint of a smile. Just eyes on strangers, he said quietly, though he knew it was more than that. He had walked into too many rooms in his life where silence said more than words, and he recognized the atmosphere now. Suspicion, resentment, maybe even hostility. The children tried to focus on their menus, though Dakota kept glancing around. "Do you think they've got burgers?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Eat your breakfast first," Gina said, but her voice carried a forced lightness. Before Chuck could reply, the door behind them swung open again, and with it came the unmistakable sound of authority. Heavy boots struck the linoleum in rhythm with the soft creak of leather gear. Chuck did not need to look to know who had entered. He felt the shift in the room, the way conversations dropped into a hush, the way some people straightened in their seats while others shrank down as if to make themselves invisible. It was the reaction of civilians when law enforcement walked in. Not respect, not comfort, but submission. "Morning," a voice drawled from the doorway. Chuck's eyes flicked toward the reflection in the diner's front window. Two men entered, both in uniform. One was tall and broad, his chest puffed out as if the badge pinned to his shirt were a crown. His steps were heavy, almost theatrical, his gaze sweeping the room with the assurance of someone convinced of his own dominance. The second was leaner, quieter, but his smirk carried its own cruelty, the kind of expression that lingered on the edge of mockery. They moved deeper into the diner, boots striking like hammers on the floor. Customers murmured greetings. "Morning, officer. Morning, boys." But their voices carried the strained tone of people who greeted not out of warmth, but out of fear. Chuck noted it all without turning his head. The patterns were familiar. He had seen it overseas, seen it in small American towns, seen it anywhere that power was used as a weapon instead of a responsibility. The waitress reappeared at their table, refilling water glasses with an unsteady hand. Chuck caught the way her eyes darted toward the two officers, then quickly back down to her tray. She poured too fast and water splashed over the rim of Danielle's glass. "Sorry," she muttered, hurriedly moving away. "Dad," Dakota whispered, leaning forward. "Everyone's acting weird." Chuck met his son's eyes, steady and calm. "Keep your focus on your breakfast," he said softly. "We're here as a family, nothing else." His voice carried the same authority that had once commanded men in training halls and combat zones, and Dakota nodded, though unease lingered in his expression. The officers made their way to the counter, one of them sliding onto a stool with a loud scrape. The taller one, clearly the leader, leaned back, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Quiet morning so far," he announced to no one in particular, but his words felt like a declaration. Just keeping an eye on things. Chuck knew the type. Men who filled silence with sound, who spread their presence wide and demanded attention without asking. It was not the uniform that made them dangerous, but the arrogance behind it. The diner had shifted again, and though no one said it, everyone was waiting to see where that presence would land. Gina pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the table. Danielle ducked her head, pretending to study the menu, though her cheeks flushed. Chuck placed his hand lightly over Gina's, a silent reassurance. He had dealt with men like this before, and he knew the rules of their game. Intimidation was only as effective as the reaction it provoked. Still, he felt the weight pressing heavier with each passing moment. The officers had not yet spoken directly to them, but Chuck knew it was only a matter of time. He could already sense the way their glances lingered, the way they measured the family like hunters circling prey. And though he remained calm, he prepared himself, because the air in that diner no longer smelled of bacon and coffee alone. It carried the sour edge of confrontation and the taste of something darker stirring beneath the quiet. The waitress had left them alone for a few moments, and for a time it seemed as though perhaps the tension would pass. that the stares and the whispers might fade back into the background hum of a small-town diner. Chuck knew better. The silence was not the end of it, but the pause before the storm. He kept his eyes on his family, listening to Gina's soft voice as she tried to coax the children into choosing something from the menu. Dakota muttered that he just wanted a burger, while Danilee quietly insisted she would rather have pancakes. They argued half-heartedly, their voices thin, edged with unease. It was the kind of forced normalcy children attempt when they know something is wrong but do not want to admit it out loud. The first officer, the tall one with the booming voice and the puffed-up chest, broke the balance. He swung around on his stool at the counter, resting one elbow on the bar as he leaned back to survey the diner. His eyes slid over the other customers with disinterest until they landed on the Norris family. A slow grin crept across his face, a grin that was less amusement and more the satisfaction of a predator having chosen its prey. He leaned toward his partner, muttered something, and both men chuckled. The sound carried clearly through the quiet, mocking, and deliberate. Moments later they rose. The taller one stretched his arms as though he had simply tired of sitting, but the deliberate swagger in his walk betrayed his intent. He sauntered toward the Norris booth, his partner trailing behind him, silent but smirking, his hand resting lazily near his belt, as though the weight of his holster gave him comfort. Chuck did not move. His posture remained relaxed, his arm resting lightly on the table, but his eyes tracked the approach with the sharp focus of a man who had spent his life recognizing threats. He felt Gina stiffen beside him, saw the quick glance Dakota cast toward him, silently asking what to do. Danilee lowered her gaze to her notebook, clutching it tightly. "Well, well," the taller officer said, stopping just short of the booth. His voice carried easily, pitched to be overheard by the entire diner. "Look what we got here. New faces in town." He smiled wider, but there was no warmth in it, only the oily smugness of a man certain of his authority. "Ain't every day we get celebrities gracing our little corner of the world." Chuck gave him a steady look, but said nothing. Silence, he had learned long ago, was often the most powerful reply. It unbalanced aggressors more than anger. Yet silence also emboldened those who mistook calm for weakness, and the officer was one of them. The second officer leaned against the booth's divider, his eyes lingering not on Chuck, but on Gina. His smirk sharpened, his gaze dropping lower than it should have before climbing back up to meet her eyes with a look that was unmistakably suggestive. "Sure is our lucky day," he drawled, his voice slick with insinuation. "Pretty lady like you showing up here." Gina's chin lifted, her eyes hard, but her hand tightened on the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Dakota bristled, starting to rise, but Chuck placed a firm hand on his arm beneath the table. The boy froze, swallowing his anger, though his cheeks flushed crimson. "What brings you folks here?" the first officer continued, shifting his weight so he loomed slightly over the table. "Just passing through or planning on staying a while." His tone made it clear the answer did not matter. The question was not about curiosity, but about establishing dominance, about reminding them that they were outsiders and he was not. Chuck's gaze never wavered. He answered calmly, evenly, his words polite but stripped of any hint of submission. The officer's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before twisting tighter. "Is that so?" he said, his voice louder now, carrying further. "Funny thing, sometimes strangers cause trouble around here. Folks don't always take kindly to them." He chuckled, glancing around the room as if inviting the other customers to join in. A few shifted uncomfortably but kept their eyes down. The second officer let out a laugh of his own, a sharper sound, and leaned closer to Gina. "Course, not all strangers are trouble," he murmured, just loud enough for the children to hear. "Some just make the place a little prettier." His fingers tapped the divider beside her, a subtle, threatening rhythm. Chuck felt the tension in his wife's body, saw the fury in his children's faces. His own expression remained unchanged, but inside he measured the distance, the angles, the possible moves. He was not afraid. Fear had no place in him after all the years of combat, of training, of facing danger head-on. But anger stirred, a deep, controlled anger born not of insult to himself, but of insult to those he loved. Still he waited. Patience was its own weapon. The officers pressed further. The first one reached out and tapped Dakota on the shoulder with 2 fingers, a mock gesture of camaraderie that carried the weight of condescension. "Strong kid," he said loudly. "Bet you think you could take on the world, huh? Got your daddy's name? You think that makes you tough?" Dakota's jaw clenched, his mouth opening to retort. But again, Chuck's steady hand under the table stopped him. The boy bit his tongue, his anger simmering in his eyes. The second officer chuckled and shook his head as though amused by their restraint. He looked back at Gina, his smirk never fading. "Don't be shy now," he said. "We're just being friendly." Friendly was the last word anyone in that diner would have used. The air was thick with unease. Conversations had died entirely. Forks scraped plates with deliberate slowness. Chairs creaked as people shifted but avoided looking up. It was as if the whole room held its breath, pretending to ignore what everyone knew was happening. Fear kept them silent, the same fear that had likely kept them silent many times before. Gina finally spoke, her voice firm though edged with steel. She reminded them that they were simply here to eat, that their family wanted no trouble. The first officer laughed, a booming sound that made heads turn. "No trouble?" he repeated mockingly. "Ma'am, around here we decide what trouble looks like." Eber. Chuck's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. He looked at each of the officers in turn, his eyes calm, steady, unyielding. He knew this was only the beginning, that these men would not stop at words. They had chosen their targets, and they intended to push until they got the reaction they craved. But he also knew his own boundaries, the line he would allow no one to cross. He felt it looming closer with each passing second, and he could already see the moment coming when patience would no longer be enough. The waitress hovered near the counter, her hands trembling as she refilled a cup of coffee. She glanced once toward the booth, her eyes filled with something that looked like shame, then looked away quickly. The other customers avoided even that much, focusing intently on their plates, their coffee, their napkins, anything but the confrontation unfolding in plain view. The silence of complicity was almost as loud as the officers' voices, and in the midst of it all, Chuck Norris sat unmoving, a still point in the storm, his family around him. His wife's hand trembled under the table, his children's eyes burned with a mixture of fear and defiance, and still he waited. Because he knew that when the line was crossed, when words turned into something more, he would rise, and nothing in that diner would ever be the same again. The silence in the diner had taken on a different texture. No longer the silence of suspicion or idle curiosity, but the thick, suffocating stillness of fear. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick more loudly, each second punctuating the growing tension. The officers lingered at the booth, their presence heavy, their smiles mocking. Chuck sat unmoving, but his eyes were alive, sharp and unwavering, calculating every detail, as if the room were a battlefield he had already mapped. He had been patient through their words, through the insinuations and provocations, but the moment hung balanced on the edge of a knife. It was only a matter of time before someone tipped it. The taller officer leaned in closer, his bulk casting a shadow across the table. He tapped his fingers against the formica surface, slow and deliberate, as if each rap of his knuckles was a countdown. "You're awful quiet," he said with exaggerated casualness, his tone pitched loud enough to reach every corner of the diner. "Man like you, with a name like yours, you'd think you'd have something to say." His eyes glittered with challenge, with the cruel delight of a man who thrived on bending others beneath him. Chuck's expression did not change. "We came here to eat breakfast," he said simply, his voice calm, even, carrying across the room without being raised. "That's all." The officer laughed, throwing his head back as if the words were the funniest thing he had ever heard. "Breakfast," he repeated, looking around at the other diners, seeking their validation. "You hear that? Man comes in here, thinks he's going to sit quiet, have himself some pancakes, and not answer to the people who keep this town safe." His partner smirked, shaking his head as though it were a shameful joke. Dakota shifted in his seat, his fist clenched under the table. He opened his mouth to speak, but Gina laid a hand on his arm, shaking her head. "Don't," she whispered, her voice taut. Her eyes met Chuck's, filled with both fear and trust. She knew her husband was a man of control, A man who would wait until waiting was no longer possible. The second officer's smirk grew as his gaze fixed on her. "You ought to teach your boy some manners," he drawled. His hand rested on the divider beside her, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached further, his fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the table. The touch was light, casual to the eye of an outsider, but it was no accident. His eyes told the truth. This was not clumsy contact but a test, a deliberate violation meant to humiliate her and provoke her husband. Gina's breath caught, her lips parting in shock before she jerked her hand back. Dakota half rose from his seat, fury etched across his face. But Chuck's hand pressed down on his son's arm, firm and unyielding. "Sit," he murmured, not taking his eyes off the officer. Dakota froze, his jaw clenched, trembling with the effort of restraint. The taller officer chuckled, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. Now, he said mockingly, "don't get riled up. My partner's just being friendly. That's all it is." But the smirk on the second man's face betrayed the lie. He leaned a fraction closer to Gina, his voice low and taunting. "Pretty thing, like you ought to be used to attention." That was the line. Chuck rose slowly, smoothly, every movement controlled. The vinyl seat squeaked as he stood, and the sound cut through the silence like a shot. The officer straightened instinctively, taken aback by the quiet authority that radiated from the man before him. Chuck's face was calm, but his eyes burned with something deeper, something older than anger. It was the steel of a man who had fought battles not for pride, but for survival, who had carried responsibility for lives and never shirked it. The entire diner seemed to draw in a collective breath. Forks paused halfway to mouths, cups halted in midair. The cook in the kitchen window froze, his spatula hovering over the grill. Even the waitress, clutching her coffee pot at the counter, stood rooted to the spot, her eyes wide. Everyone knew something had shifted, that whatever game the officers had been playing was about to turn into something else entirely. The taller officer tried to reassert himself, puffing his chest out as he stepped closer. "You think standing up makes you tougher?" he sneered. "Sit back down, that's an order." Chuck's voice was quiet, but it carried through the diner with absolute clarity. "You don't give me orders." The words landed like a hammer. For a moment, the officer faltered, his mouth opening as though to reply but finding no words. His partner's smirk twitched, faltered, then returned, though less certain than before. The power dynamic had shifted in that instant, and everyone in the room felt it. Gina's eyes never left her husband. She knew this side of him, had seen glimpses of it before. The calm before a storm, the stillness of a man who only acted when action was unavoidable. Her heart pounded in her chest, but a strange calm settled over her too. She trusted him, trusted the choices he would make. Dakota and Dannelly stared at their father with wide eyes. They had always known him as strong, as steady, as someone who taught them discipline and respect. But now they saw the part of him that others only whispered about, the part forged in combat, honed in training, tested by fire. The taller officer bristled, trying to regain ground. "You don't want to make a mistake here," he warned, his voice louder now, edged with a hint of uncertainty. Chuck's gaze never wavered. "The only mistake," he said evenly, "is thinking you can lay a hand on my wife and walk away without consequence." The second officer's smirk slipped entirely, replaced by something harder, less sure. He shifted his stance, his hand brushing the edge of his belt, as though reassured by the weapon there. But Chuck's eyes flicked to the motion, and the officer froze, suddenly aware that the man before him had already calculated every angle, every move, every possible outcome. The diner was a pressure cooker, every soul inside waiting for the explosion. Some part of everyone present wanted to look away, to pretend they weren't witnessing what was happening, but no one could. They were transfixed, caught between fear and awe, watching the slow unfolding of something inevitable. Gina sat straighter now, her fear transforming into resolve. Her children's anger had not lessened, but they too held themselves back, trusting their father. The officers might have thought they had the upper hand, but they had miscalculated. They had crossed the line, and in doing so, they had awakened the storm. Chuck stood silent for a heartbeat longer, letting the weight of the moment settle. He had waited, given them every chance to back down, to realize the danger of their arrogance. They had not taken it. And so, though he remained calm, though his voice never rose, though his movements carried no flourish, there was no mistaking it. The time for patience had ended. And everyone in that diner knew, even before the first motion came, that nothing in the room would ever be the same again. The diner seemed to hold its breath, every person frozen in anticipation of what would happen next. The officers had pushed too far, had mocked, insulted, and violated, and now the quiet man who had sat so calmly with his family stood before them. No longer just a father at breakfast, but something more. Chuck's presence filled the room, not loud or theatrical, but with a force that needed no declaration. He had been patient. He had allowed them every chance to step back, but they had not, and in crossing the line they had invited a reckoning. The taller officer tried first to reassert himself, his chest puffed out, his voice booming to remind everyone of his authority. "Sit down," he barked. "This isn't your fight. You don't tell us what to do." He stepped forward, closing the distance as though size alone could intimidate. But he had already lost the advantage, though he didn't yet realize it. Chuck's eyes remained fixed, calm and unwavering, a stillness that unnerved more than any show of anger ever could. The second officer shifted uneasily, his earlier smirk now brittle. His hand brushed against his belt again, instinctive, the reassurance of the weapon at his side. But there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a doubt that hadn't been there before. He could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. He was no longer the one in control, no longer certain the man in front of him could be cowed with a uniform and a badge. Dakota and Danilee sat pressed back against the booth, their breaths quick, their eyes wide. They had seen their father in so many roles, gentle teacher, stern mentor, quiet protector. But now they were witnessing the side of him the world spoke of in whispers, the side forged in years of combat training and discipline. They watched his every movement, trying to memorize it, trying to understand how a man could radiate so much power without raising his voice or even clenching his fists. Gina too watched, her heart pounding, but her expression steady. She knew this moment would come. She had felt the tension growing from the moment the officers walked in, had sensed the inevitability of confrontation. Yet she did not feel fear now, only a fierce pride. Her husband had always embodied control, strength guided by principle, and she knew whatever happened, it would not be reckless. It would be precise, measured, as he had always been. The taller officer reached out, his hand moving toward Chuck's chest as though to shove him back into his seat. It was a mistake. In the space of a heartbeat, Chuck moved. His left hand rose, fluid and sure, catching the officer's wrist before it could make contact. The grip was firm but not brutal, the kind of controlled hold that spoke of countless hours spent perfecting technique. The officer's eyes widened as he tried to pull back, only to find his hand trapped as though caught in a vice. With a subtle twist, Chuck applied pressure to a nerve point along the wrist. Pain shot up the man's arm, sharp and paralyzing, forcing his fingers open. The officer gasped, his bravado faltering as he realized he was no longer in control of his own body. Chuck stepped forward, guiding the man's momentum downward. There was no violence in it, no unnecessary force, just the inevitability of leverage perfectly applied. The officer's knees buckled, and in moments he found himself kneeling on the diner floor, staring up at the man he had tried to dominate. A stunned silence fell over the room. Forks clattered to plates. The waitress's coffee pot tilted in her trembling hands, spilling dark liquid onto the counter. The cook leaned forward in the service window, his eyes wide with disbelief. No one had seen movement like that before. So fast, so efficient, so absolute. The second officer reacted with anger rather than caution. With a growl, he lunged, reaching toward his holster. But Chuck was already moving. His right hand swept up, intercepting the man's arm before it could reach the weapon. A pivot of his hips, a precise redirection of force, and the officer's own momentum carried him forward. Chuck guided him effortlessly into a position where his arm was bent behind his back, locked at an angle that offered no escape but did not break. The officer struggled, his breath ragged, but each movement only tightened the hold, forcing him down onto the table beside the booth. Plates rattled, silverware clinked, but the hold was secure, unshakable. "Stay still," Chuck said, his voice low, calm, but carrying to every ear in the diner. "No one here wants to see you hurt." The officer froze, his breath coming in quick bursts, his face flushed with pain and humiliation. The taller one still knelt on the floor, clutching his wrist, his expression stunned. Together they looked less like men of authority and more like boys who had underestimated their opponent. Around them, the diner had transformed into an audience. Phones were raised, shaky hands recording every moment. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, disbelief, awe, fear. The customers who had once lowered their eyes now stared openly, witnessing a reversal of power they had never dared imagine. The men who had ruled with intimidation were now subdued in front of everyone, undone not by brute force, but by the mastery of discipline. Dakota's eyes shone with a mix of shock and pride. He had always known his father was strong, but this was something else, something beyond strength. "Dad," he whispered, but the word caught in his throat. Danilee clutched her notebook to her chest, her knuckles white. She could not look away, mesmerized by the precision of it all. She saw not chaos but control, not violence but a demonstration of how discipline could tame even the wildest aggression. Gina's breath left her in a slow exhale. She reached out, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder, anchoring her. Her eyes never left her husband. She had seen him perform on screens, seen him win tournaments, seen him command respect wherever he went. But this moment, this quiet assertion of power in the face of cruelty, was the essence of who he truly was. The taller officer sputtered, finding his voice again as he struggled against the pressure on his wrist. This is assault on an officer," he stammered, but the words carried no conviction. His voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. "No," Chuck replied evenly, his tone steady as stone. "This is self-defense. This is restraint. The only assault here was yours." The words hung in the air, undeniable, a truth that everyone in the diner had witnessed with their own eyes. Murmurs grew louder. Someone near the counter whispered, "He's not even trying. He's just controlling them." Another muttered, "That's not fighting. That's something else entirely." Chuck eased his grip slightly, enough to lessen the pain, but not enough to release control. He looked at both men in turn, his eyes clear and unyielding. "This ends now," he said. "You've embarrassed yourselves. You've abused your power. My family will not be your target." The second officer, face pressed against the table, muttered something unintelligible, his pride too wounded to admit defeat. Chuck tightened the hold just enough to elicit a grunt of pain, then released him, stepping back with the same calm precision he had shown throughout. The man staggered upright, rubbing his arm, his eyes filled with both fury and confusion. The taller officer remained kneeling a moment longer, breathing heavily before he too scrambled to his feet. He did not meet Chuck's gaze. Neither of them did. Their bravado had shattered. They had been shown the difference between authority and strength, between intimidation and mastery. The diner buzzed now, conversations overlapping, phones still recording. The officers looked around, realizing every eye was on them. Every witness had seen their downfall. They tried to straighten their uniforms, to recover some shred of dignity, but it was gone. Chuck stood tall, composed, not triumphant, but resolute. He had not acted for glory. He had acted for his family, for their dignity, for the principle that some lines cannot be crossed without consequence. Gina rose slowly from the booth, her children following. She stood beside her husband, her eyes locked on the two men who had tried to humiliate her. She said nothing, but the look on her face was eloquent enough. It was the look of a woman whose protector had reminded the world that she was not alone, that she was respected, that she was safe. Chuck turned his head slightly, meeting the eyes of the onlookers. He said nothing, but his gaze carried its own message. Strength is not in domination, but in discipline, not in cruelty, but in control. Then he placed a hand on Gina's shoulder, guiding her and the children back into the booth. His movements were calm, deliberate, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though he had simply adjusted the balance of the room back to what it should have been. The two officers retreated, their faces red, their eyes darting around the room for support they no longer had. The authority they had once wielded so carelessly had been stripped away, revealed for what it was, a brittle mask that shattered the moment it was tested against true strength. And as the Norris family sat together once more, the diner buzzed with whispers and awe, but also with a newfound respect. For in that small roadside cafe, on an ordinary day, they had all been given a lesson not in violence, but in discipline. The sound in the diner did not return all at once. It trickled back slowly, like a hesitant stream after a drought. Whispers first, then the scrape of forks against plates, the clink of coffee cups, the low hum of conversation struggling to regain their footing. But nothing in the room was the same as it had been just minutes earlier. The two officers, who had strutted in with the certainty of men untouchable in their authority, now lingered awkwardly near the counter, their faces flushed, their uniforms disheveled, their power exposed as brittle and false. The customers, once cowed into silence by the weight of their presence, watched openly now, their eyes following every twitch, every shift of their posture. Chuck stood by the booth a moment longer, his breathing calm, his shoulders square. He had not broken a sweat. His hands, which had so precisely controlled the storm moments ago, now rested easily at his sides. He looked not triumphant, not boastful, but resolute, a man who had defended his family and drawn a line that would not be crossed. The lesson had been delivered, and its echo lingered in the silence that still hung like smoke in the air. Gina rose beside him, her movements graceful, her chin held high. She felt no need to speak, for her husband's actions had already said more than words ever could. Her eyes swept the room, and she saw it clearly in the faces of those who watched. A shift, not just in the officers, but in the entire diner. Respect. Not the kind demanded by intimidation, but the kind earned by integrity and strength. She turned to her children, touching each gently on the shoulder, guiding them with the calm assurance of a mother who knew they had witnessed something important, something that would shape them for years to come. Dakota still vibrated with the aftershocks of adrenaline, his fists clenching and unclenching, as though trying to release the tension that still coursed through him. He stared at his father, his eyes wide, his voice caught between awe and disbelief. "You didn't even hurt them," he murmured, as though realizing it fully only now. "You stopped them, but you didn't hurt them." Chuck looked at his son, his gaze steady. "That's not what strength is for," he said softly, and Dakota nodded, his jaw tightening with understanding, even as the lesson settled slowly into him. Danilee clutched her notebook tightly to her chest, her heart still racing. She had seen her father on screens, in the stories that the world told of him, but this had been different. This had been no performance, no choreography, no script. It had been real, and in that reality she saw not the myth but the man, and in the man she saw something greater than the myths had ever captured. "They couldn't do anything," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "They had all the power, and they couldn't do anything against you." Gina smiled faintly at her daughter's words and reached out to smooth a strand of hair back from her face. "That's because true power doesn't come from a badge," she said gently. "It comes from discipline, from knowing when to act and when not to." The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, still rubbing his wrist. His earlier bravado shattered. His partner glanced toward the door, as though debating whether to leave, but pride anchored him in place. Neither of them spoke. They could not. To speak would be to acknowledge what everyone had seen, that their authority had been broken, their cruelty exposed, their dominance reversed. The waitress, who had been trembling at the counter, finally moved. She set down the coffee pot with a clatter and wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes darting nervously toward Chuck. She opened her mouth and closed it again, unable to find words. At last she whispered, almost too softly to be heard, "Thank you." It was not just gratitude but confession, the voice of someone who had witnessed too much and stayed silent too often. Chuck inclined his head slightly, accepting the words without demanding more. He knew what it had cost her to say them. He knew the fear that still lingered in her heart, the fear that men like those officers thrived on. But he also knew that the seed of change had been planted in that diner, whether the officers realized it or not. He turned to his family, placing a hand gently on Gina's back, guiding her and the children toward the door. The movement was calm, deliberate, as though he were simply leaving after a finished meal. Yet every step was followed by the eyes of the diners, eyes that would remember this moment long after the Norris family had driven away. As they passed the counter, Chuck paused. He turned his head just enough to meet the eyes of the two officers. His expression was not one of gloating or anger. It was steady, unflinching, a reminder of what had transpired. "Respect is not given by force," he said quietly. "It's earned. Remember that." The words cut deeper than any blow could have. The taller officer dropped his gaze. The second clenched his jaw, but his eyes betrayed the sting. They had no answer, no defense. They could only watch as the family stepped past them and toward the sunlight spilling through the glass door. The bell jingled as they exited, the same cheerful sound it had made when they had first entered, but now it carried an entirely different weight. Outside, the air was thick with summer heat, cicadas droning in the trees. The SUV gleamed in the sunlight, waiting patiently, a vessel that would carry them back to the safety of the open road. Chuck opened the door for Gina and the children, helping them inside, his movements unhurried, calm, as though the storm had passed and left nothing but peace in its wake. Gina settled into her seat, her hands finally relaxing as she exhaled a long, steady breath. She looked at her husband, her eyes shining with pride. "You didn't just protect us," she said softly. "You reminded everyone in there what real strength looks like." Chuck smiled faintly, starting the engine, the hum of the vehicle rising beneath them. "Strength means nothing without dignity," he replied, "and dignity means never letting fear decide who we are." As the SUV pulled out of the gravel lot, the diner grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the memory of what had happened there remained vivid. Inside, the customers would talk, whisper, share what they had seen. Some would carry it as inspiration, others as warning, but none would forget. The officers would return to their routines, but the shame of that day would linger with them, gnawing at the edges of their pride. Perhaps it would change them, perhaps it would not, but the truth had been laid bare, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Dakota leaned forward from the back seat, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll never forget this," he said. "The way you didn't lose your temper, the way you stayed calm. I want to be like that." Chuck glanced at his son in the mirror, his eyes kind. "Then remember this moment. Strength isn't about winning fights. It's about knowing which fights matter." The road stretched out before them, long and sunlit, winding through fields and trees that shimmered in the heat. The family drove on, leaving behind the small town, the diner, the men who had tried to use power as a weapon. They carried with them not just the relief of safety, but the deeper certainty of who they were and what bound them together. Inside the diner, silence lingered even after they left, the echo of their presence clinging to the walls. The waitress stood still at the counter, her hands resting on the coffee pot, her eyes distant. The cook leaned against the service window, shaking his head slowly. The customers spoke in hushed tones, replaying the scene again and again. And in the corner, the two officers sat slumped, stripped of the fear they had once inspired, their pride hollowed out by the quiet, unshakable lesson they had been given. On the road, the Norris family drove forward into the bright expanse of the day. Chuck's hands rested steady on the wheel, his eyes on the horizon. He did not dwell on what had happened, nor did he savor it. To him it was simple. His family had been threatened, and he had protected them. Nothing more, nothing less. Yet in that simplicity lay the essence of his strength. The world outside rolled past, endless sky and golden fields, the promise of new places and fresh starts. Gina reached over and took his hand, her grip firm, her heart steady. Their children sat quietly in the back, the weight of what they had seen still settling into their young minds. And as the SUV moved farther from Oakwood County, the family carried with them not fear, not bitterness, but a quiet pride. The storm was over, the lesson had been taught, and in the silence that followed, dignity endured. Before you go, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And if this kept you on the edge of your seat, you'll want to watch the next video. It's even more shocking than what you just saw. Check out our other stories too. each one wilder than the last. And share this video with your friends. Let them see the twist no one expects.